The reason I have difficulty believing the God of Abraham is the benevolent, all-loving God he is claimed to be is because the practice of slavery appears to be endorsed throughout the Bible. The Bible does not endorse slavery, but slavery was a common practice throughout the ancient world. Slavery often served a vital purpose, such as allowing people to pay off debts, as in the case of indentured servants. Without all the bankruptcy and foreclosure laws as well as debt consolidation companies that we have today, there would have been no way for people living in the ancient world to recover their debts. Before we go any further, I would like to reach an agreement so we can have a basis upon which to build. For the purposes of this discussion, I will agree that the biblical God does exist. Let's also agree that morality is fixed, unchanging, and prescribed by God. And finally, I do not think anyone believes the practice of slavery is actually moral, so let's both agree that the 13th Amendment should be upheld. With that said, if you agree slavery is immoral, what difference would it make how pervasive the practice, or in what fashion slavery was used? Instead of slavery, what if men and women throughout the ancient world used sex as a tool to recover their debts? Would that make the act of premarital sex, or even adultery, any less immoral? Not according to a Christian worldview. Therefore, why do you make such arbitrary concessions when it comes to the practice of slavery? Again, it does not matter in what manner slavery was used, or how much it was ingrained in everyday life, for we have agreed that God defines morality according to fixed absolutes. Therefore, if something is immoral, then it is always immoral. We must be consistent in our understanding of moral principles, for without consistency, morality becomes meaningless. Even though the Bible describes some Israelites and Christians as owning slaves, slavery in biblical times was not the same thing as slavery as it was practiced in America before 1865. In fact, the Bible actually tells Christian masters to treat their slaves with kindness and to look out for their welfare. For example, in Ephesians chapter 6, Paul commands slaves to serve their masters as they would serve Christ and not half-heartedly. This is because, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is slave or free. Paul goes on to tell the masters to do the same thing for the slaves, and even tells the masters to not threaten their slaves, because, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. Yes, but is slavery moral? If you agree that enslaving someone is not a moral practice, then what difference would it make how the slaves were treated? I will refer to my previous analogy of prostitution. What if we could guarantee that prostitutes would only be treated with the utmost respect, in a controlled setting with security, monthly blood screenings, and so on? In fact, we could even legalize prostitution, creating an environment where the only parties involved would be consenting adults, and prostitutes would have full control over the men they choose to be their clients. What does the fact that women are being treated kindly by their brothels have to say about the Christian perception of prostitution? If you believe prostitution is immoral, then it is always immoral, no matter how much we regulate it, limit it, or how well we treat its participants. Likewise, if slavery is immoral, then it is always immoral, no matter how a master might treat his slaves or what are the reasons for enslaving them. There is no justification that can be given to explain away the enslavement of a class or race of people. Even if you, as a slave master, were the kindest slave master in the history of humankind, it would do nothing to legitimize the practice of slavery. You could be the nicest crack dealer in the world as well, but it would not excuse the fact you directly profit from the exploitation of other human beings. Instead of telling Christians to be kind to their slaves, why didn't Paul just come right out and completely denounce the practice of slavery altogether? Paul was not endorsing slavery, but slavery was a reality in ancient Rome, as well as most of the world at that time. Would you prefer Paul to have advised these men to possibly risk their lives by revolting, or possibly be subject to severe punishment under pagan Roman law? Christianity was a new religion, or the fulfillment of Judaism, that looked forward to a redeemed world to come, not a political system to right all the wrongs. Why would Paul have advised the slaves to do anything? Why couldn't Paul advise the slave masters, who retained all the power? Or better yet, simply speak out against slavery as being the moral injustice that it was? Never mind Paul's attempt to regulate slavery by writing letters to the Ephesians. The mere fact this immoral act was allowed to continue in any fashion demonstrates his inhumane indifference to the suffering of millions of innocent people. What if something like bestiality were just as pervasive as slavery? Don't you think Paul would have stood in direct opposition to his practice? Are you really attempting to suggest Jesus and Paul's hands were completely tied with regard to speaking out against the issue of slavery? Let me ask you, are we to expect Christianity to stand up for what is right and just, despite slavery being a common practice? Are we to expect Paul to have spoken out against slavery because it is fundamentally immoral, despite whether or not an anti-slavery position was unpopular for its time? The answer is yes. Is Jesus and the apostles standing up for what is moral and championing the rights of an unjustly persecuted class of people too great an expectation? You claim biblical slavery unjustly persecuted an entire class of people, but how do you even know the form of slavery being practiced by Christians during the time of Jesus was so unjust? The slaves mentioned in the Bible were indentured servants paying off a debt, and as we have already seen, Paul even tells the Ephesians to treat their slaves well. Let's take a look at 1 Peter chapter 2. Peter, one of Jesus' closest apostles, tells slaves to submit to their masters, even those who are harsh. Peter actually uses the words unjust suffering to describe the predicament of the slaves. Here we can plainly see that Peter, in full conscience, knows the act of slavery is unjust and that it causes suffering. Peter even compares the unjust suffering of slaves to the unjust suffering of Christ, and that such suffering is holy in the eyes of God. The slaves being addressed in this passage are not under contract to pay off a debt, for they are being worked and unjustly beaten. Furthermore, there is no attempt to even condemn the unjust beatings. This passage serves to excuse the exploitation of millions of people in bondage, telling them to just deal with their suffering by following the example of Christ. To say that slavery was merely an accepted part of life, and no one was able to speak in direct opposition to this vile practice, is similar to saying something equally absurd, like, because the ancient world widely accepted prostitution and adultery, Christianity could not have taken a firm stance against them, because it was merely an upstart religion with no political affiliation. An objective moral truth is true no matter what time period you happen to live in. If slavery is objectively wrong in the present, then it must have been objectively wrong in the past, according to our previously agreed upon standard of God's fixed moral absolutes. If slavery was indeed viewed as an injustice to Peter, Jesus, or any of the other apostles, as is clearly the case, and they did not do anything to rectify this matter, then they are just as morally accountable as the slave masters. That's called aiding and abetting. You cannot know someone is responsible for a crime and say nothing, or withhold information from the police. Jesus is certainly vocal about his opinions on adultery and murder. In fact, Jesus goes so far as to equate lust with adultery and hate with murder. With such opinionated, conservative views on these two issues, why the apathetic indifference to the issue of slavery? Although Jesus is not recorded as directly addressing the immorality of slavery by name, just because he was not recorded does not mean Jesus never talked about it. I am not in a position to assume anything about any historical figure, especially one living 2,000 years ago. Are you? Therefore, if Jesus' true views on slavery were not recorded, then the point is moot. But we are not discussing the possibility of Jesus having said something. Sure, Jesus could have talked about the immorality of slavery, just as easily as he could have flown to the moon and back. However, we are not discussing hypothetical scenarios. We are discussing the written record, and the very real implications the record had on the suffering of countless millions of men, women, and children at the hands of Christian slave masters. Although it might be true slaves suffered unjustly, as we pointed out in 1 Peter chapter 2, Jesus was ultimately concerned with our eternal destination, not how well life goes in this world. If that is true, then wouldn't performing an immoral act such as slavery lead one down the road to eternal damnation? Was the irrevocable damage to the immortal souls of Christian slave masters of no concern to Jesus Christ? Furthermore, there are no other immoral acts that could be worse than slavery, because for so many people, slavery was a fate much worse than even being murdered. African American literature of the 19th century describes in great detail the magnitude of what many slaves were forced to endure throughout the course of their lives. Slaves were treated like animals that needed to be tamed and their spirits broken, much like the domestication process of wild animals. In fact, the same methods of dehumanization was used by the Nazis in concentration camps during World War II. In reading the works of Frederick Douglass, his fear and desperation are palpable in his recounting of the extreme brutality and senseless acts of violence visited upon him and his fellow slaves as their spirits were shattered. Douglass describes slaves being treated no better than livestock, and in many instances, far, far worse. I have often been awakened by the dawn of day by the most heart-rending shrieks of an own aunt of mine, whom he used to tie up to a joist and beat her upon her naked back until she was literally covered with blood. No words, no tears, no prayers from his gory victim seemed to move his iron heart from its bloody purpose. The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped, and where the blood ran fastest, there was hush, and not until overcome by fatigue would he cease to swing the blood-clotted cowskin. I remember the first time I ever witnessed this horrible exhibition. I was quite a child, but I well remember it. It was the first of a long series of such outrages, of which I was doomed to be witness and participant. It struck me with awful force. It was the blood-stained fate, the entrance to the hell of slavery through which I was about to pass. It was the most terrible spectacle. I wish I could commit to paper the feelings with which I beheld it. But to add insult to injury, after receiving their beatings, the slaves would often be treated to readings from Scripture. This just further demonstrates that these horrendous acts were perpetrated by devout believers in the Christian God, who adamantly adhered to Scripture and justified the practice of keeping slaves through Scripture. Every year brings with it multitudes of this mixed race class of slaves. It was doubtless in consequence of a knowledge of this fact that one great statesman of the South predicted the downfall of slavery by the inevitable laws of population. Whether this prophecy is ever fulfilled or not, it is nevertheless plain that a very different looking class of people are springing up at the South, and are now held in slavery from those originally brought to this country from Africa. And if their increase do no other good, it will do away with the force of the argument that God cursed Ham, and therefore American slavery is right. Here Douglass is referring to the common argument taken from the Bible to justify the enslavement of people with darker skin. In Genesis chapter 9, verse 25, Noah places a curse on Canaan, Ham's son and Noah's grandson. There is no question the form of slavery that was practiced by Americans was very cruel, but how these Christians misused the Bible is not the Bible's fault. The Christians that engaged in the European and American slave trade twisted Scripture to fit their own agenda, and thus were not true Christians. Although it might be true that Christians twisted or reinterpreted the Scripture to fit their own agenda, that would only be the case if the Bible actually bothered speaking in direct opposition to the practice of slavery. With such potential for abuse, Jesus and the apostles could not afford to remain silent on this issue. Surely with the power of omniscience at his command, God could foresee all the pain and suffering at the hands of the American and European slave trades, and how the very same passages Jesus preached and the apostles took down with pen would be used to justify one of the most horrendous evils ever perpetrated upon the earth. Therefore, instead of remaining ambiguous on this subject, and even using slavery to illustrate parables, why didn't Jesus come right out and condemn slavery directly, making no bones about it? Slavery is wrong, and we should not do it. If Jesus had come out in direct opposition to slavery, then at the very least, the ambiguous passages found in the Bible could not have been so easily manipulated in a way as to appear to justify the practice of slavery. Jesus could have easily addressed this issue on numerous occasions, and only he, as the Son of God, was in the unique position to do so. The reason Jesus may not have directly opposed slavery was because he did not come as a politician. The Jewish leaders certainly had expected a Messiah who would come to crush Rome and liberate them based on their understanding of Old Testament prophecies. But Jesus said, "For the Son of Man has come to save that which was lost." Jesus did not come to change the world politically, but to save the lost and redeem mankind to God. Do we not make laws with regard to moral issues? We certainly have laws against cold-blooded murder, which I will safely assume we can both agree is immoral as well as illegal. Why then do you continue to make concessions for slavery on this point? Even if Jesus came back to abolish the sacrificial, dietary, and judicial laws of the nation of Israel, he would still be bound to the moral law. Therefore, if slavery is immoral, then Jesus was dutifully bound to speak in opposition to it, regardless if this position was unpopular at the time. It does not matter if Jesus did not come as a politician, for slavery is a moral issue, and Jesus is well known for his moral instruction. So why weren't he and the apostles proselytizing against slavery and denying slave masters access to heaven for engaging in this practice? Because Jesus did not want the religion to become politicized? If that is true, and Jesus had the ear of every Christian slaveholder throughout time, but would rather let millions suffer under the oppression of slavery because he did not come to change the world politically, then Jesus was far from the moral teacher Christians make him out to be, and Christian morality is essentially bankrupt. However, slavery is a social injustice, not a political issue to be debated or voted upon, a fact that is curiously overlooked unless the slaves in question happen to be God's chosen people. God went to such lengths to free the Hebrews from bondage that he kills every firstborn child in Egypt, from princes to livestock. At least we can give God credit for being consistent, or rather indiscriminate, when it comes to acts of infanticide. But are we really to believe that somehow God cannot maintain consistency with his views on slavery? God certainly did not view Hebrew liberty from Egyptian bondage as a political issue that should remain untouched and allowed to be resolved on its own.
Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, let my people go.
If we are all God's children, why shouldn't all people enjoy the same rights? Christ came to unite all people under that message. No longer were the Jews God's chosen people, because Christianity was a religion for everyone, Jew and Gentile alike. So why wasn't God's position on slavery regarding the Hebrews in Exodus extended to all slaves, such as those found in the Gospels? The right to not be beaten, to not work without pay, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are human rights that all humans must be free to enjoy. The Declaration of Independence labels these as unalienable rights given to us by the Creator, but as we can plainly see, that is certainly not the case. God never extends these rights to slaves, and neither did the Founding Fathers. Christian men used the Bible as motivation and justification to enslave an entire race of people. Jesus had the opportunity to stop the practice of slavery in its tracks, to prevent the exploitation of millions of men, women, and children throughout history, but he did not. We are not talking about politics or social reform. We are talking about establishing a moral and ethical code of conduct that would ring throughout the centuries to come. Jesus knew his teachings would be written down and learned from, yet still made no attempt to circumvent the injustices perpetrated under slavery. If slavery is immoral now, then slavery was immoral in the past, unless I'm missing something and morality is completely arbitrary. Although Jesus did not speak in direct opposition to slavery, he did indirectly address slavery in the Gospel account of Matthew, as well as Luke with a parallel passage. Both of these verses are from the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus exposits the 10 Commandments and reveals that they are not about outward behavior, but inward intentions of the heart. If we are not to even bear false witness against a fellow man or woman, then logic would dictate that slavery would certainly not be acceptable. Jesus says, "He who hates his brother is a murderer." If hatred is seen as murder in God's eyes, then slavery most certainly is seen as nothing less than hatred, especially the kind of slavery you accuse the Bible of condoning and supporting. I don't think it's possible to find a more ambiguous verse than Matthew 7 or Luke 6 regarding the very clear issue of slavery. Although you cite Luke 6 as evidence that Jesus indirectly speaks against slavery, in Luke 12, we find a record of Jesus addressing the issue of slavery directly. But this passage does not support beating slaves. This is in the context of a parable, which were stories that Jesus told to help us understand spiritual truths. Another example of this would be the parable where Jesus likens God to an unjust judge. The point is not for us to see God as unjust, but to tell us to be persistent in prayer. Likewise, the parable of the master and servant tells us we should be on the lookout and be ready for Jesus' second coming. Believers will receive their reward. Unbelievers will receive their eternal punishment. Although it is a parable, Jesus himself directly speaks about the well-known practice of viciously beating slaves, and yet again denies himself the opportunity to condemn these actions. Notice how the parable does not address the immoral practice of slavery itself, but rather, Jesus is using the practice of slavery to form an analogy between a slave master, or God, horrendously punishing his servants, or us, for not being ready upon his return. If Jesus was against slavery, would it not have made better sense to equate the practice of slavery with hell, and by not following God's word, the sinners are like slaves, toiling away their existence with no hope of escape? Then Jesus could have stated something like, liberation from slavery is similar to salvation through Christ. All men deserve to be free, and thus all men deserve their heavenly rewards, which can only be obtained by liberating themselves from slavery to sin. It took me 2 minutes to come up with an infinitely more applicable parable than Jesus. So why didn't Jesus say something to that effect? Because Jesus is excusing the practice of slavery. Jesus is claiming God will do unto us what masters do to their slaves. If God is within his limits to punish us for not following his word, then why aren't slave masters equally as justified? If that were not the case, and slave masters do not have the right to beat their slaves, then this parable would not make any sense. What if instead of slavery, Jesus used a parable of a prostitute and her pimp? Prostitutes that are not prepared when their pimps unexpectedly call upon them will be severely beaten. So too will you be punished if unprepared for the Lord's return. Does this parable make any sense? Of course not. Why would Jesus make reference to a blatantly immoral act in order to demonstrate a holy message? If Jesus believes slavery is immoral, then referencing the act of beating slaves in positive affirmation of the plans he has made for us would be a complete contradiction. However, we have many more passages regarding the unjust practice of slavery to choose from, which are neither ambiguous nor in parable form. For instance, take 1 Timothy chapter 6. Here we find very descriptive language regarding slavery. We see that slaves are treated as chattel, human animals to be placed under a yoke and made to work and serve their masters. In fact, if you're the unfortunate slave of a Christian slave master, you are commanded to serve them even better. How do you expect slaves belonging to Christian slave masters to ever get out of bondage? What would you have told an American slave master that used this passage to justify his right to own slaves? How could you possibly convince him otherwise? Nowhere are concessions made for slaves of Christian masters to become free men. In fact, this passage appears to explicitly speak against slaves ever obtaining their freedom. Now, I realize this passage also states that slave masters are devoted to the welfare of their slaves, but we have already discussed this issue. It does not matter if some slave masters looked after the welfare of their slaves or not, for this passage clearly justifies a practice that we have already determined to be unjust. If you want to justify the immoral act of slavery simply upon the grounds of how slaves were treated, then let's justify prostitution by how well we treat the prostitutes, and let's justify the practice of bestiality by how well we treat the animals. Consistency is essential with regard to morality. If we cannot be consistent in our understanding of moral issues, then morality is not fixed, it is not absolute, and right and wrong are completely arbitrary. Slavery was common throughout the Middle East, as far back as ancient Egypt, and if God had simply ignored it, then there wouldn't have been any rules on how to treat slaves and servants. Therefore, they would have no rights whatsoever. God's rules regarding slavery show that God cared for slaves. If God did not protect slaves and bondservants with his commands, then people who did want to practice harsh slavery would love to move into an area where there were no governing principles on the treatment of slaves. It would have attracted those slave owners like flies. Therefore, God's laws discourage such things. In giving laws to regulate slavery, God is not saying that it is a good thing. In fact, by giving laws about it at all, he is plainly stating it is a bad thing. We don't make laws to limit or regulate good things. After all, you won't find laws that tell us it's wrong to be healthy, or that if water is too clean, we have to add pollution to it. Therefore, the fact slavery is included in the regulations of the Old Testament at all assumes that it is a bad thing, which needs regulation to prevent the damage from being too great. Driving a car is certainly a good thing, but we place regulations on driving so it does not become hazardous. Safe food is also certainly a good thing, but we regulate how food is to be handled in order to prevent hazards to one's health. And this is also the same reason we have health inspections in restaurants. Laws develop in response to a need. Laws are not always there to limit bad things. We make laws to ensure safety when driving a car or handling food, not because these actions are inherently wrong. Likewise, regulations were placed on slavery not because the act itself was wrong in the Hebrews' eyes, but rather to regulate the practice so it would not become hazardous to the Hebrews engaging in it. If the Israelites had really viewed slavery as being a dangerously immoral practice, they would have completely outlawed it instead of merely making laws to regulate it. Indeed, all concessions in the Torah on the practice of slavery are only given to other Hebrews, but slaves from other nations never have any rights. Not only does the Bible provide laws to regulate slavery, Moses even attempts to ban slave traders in Exodus 21, where he states, "Anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession." Yes, this was obviously a valuable law at the time, preventing bandits and highway robbers from kidnapping people and ransoming or selling them. But this passage does not, as you say, show Moses banned slave traders, for this passage is addressing kidnappers. You must look to the book of Leviticus to find laws regarding the slave trade, where Moses gives very specific stipulations by which to obtain kosher slaves. Keep in mind, the book of Leviticus comes after Exodus. There is no kidnapping going on here. These slaves are legally purchased from other nations or from foreign tribes living within Israel. How these slaves arrived on the auction block is no concern under Hebrew law, for these are foreigners. These slaves could have been kidnapped, captured in war, or even born into slavery. There are no regulations on how slaves purchased from other nations are to be initially placed into bondage. This is the most difficult passage for theists to explain, because it ticks every single one of the boxes under the definition of slavery. Slaves are to be inherited property that can be passed down to one's children. We are directly told how to obtain new slaves, as they are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. The passage also stipulates that we have the authority to rule over slaves, meaning they are controlled by a master and forced to do his bidding without any promise of reimbursement. Does this passage appear to place regulations on slavery because, as you claim, the fact slavery is included in the regulations of the Old Testament at all assumes that it is a bad thing? Leviticus is not trying to regulate the injustices of slavery. Quite the contrary. It is promoting the practice while focusing the injustices onto people belonging to outside nations. Essentially what Leviticus 25 is telling us is that you can have slaves, just make sure they are not Hebrews. But if you happen to have Israelite slaves, do not be cruel to them. As we can plainly see, slaves taken from the nations around you, and temporary residents living among you, and members from their clans born in your country, have no rights as human beings. In fact, every instance the practice of slavery is mentioned throughout Mosaic law, preference is always given to fellow Israelites. God makes sure to preface the passage in Leviticus 25 with a reminder that he had just saved the Hebrews from bondage in Egypt, which was real, forced labor, and cruel bondage. The Israelites had just come out of slavery themselves, and were about to enter the Holy Land. They would have not had many slaves or servants at this point, but they obviously had some because Moses saw fit to regulate it. However, it still does not restrict people from other nations selling themselves. In fact, Exodus 21 gives instructions on how a bondservant must be treated. This is an example of an ancient form of bankruptcy, where a person has lost him or herself to debt and only has one thing left to sell: their ability to work. This is a loan, and it also says that regardless of the debt, the bondservant is to be held no longer than 6 years, unless he so chooses. Regarding Exodus 21 verse 4, if the bondservant is willing to walk away from his wife or kids, who are already bondservants with the master to begin with, then it is his own fault. It is not the master's responsibility to forgive her debt, although it certainly does not forbid him to do so if he pleases. But if the male servant did walk away without them, then he would be in defiance of the law of marriage. He has every right to stay with his family. His wife, however, is obligated to pay her debt until the master lets her free, but keep in mind this is not to exceed 6 years legally. Otherwise, a woman could deceitfully rack up debt, sell herself into slavery to cover her debt, only to marry someone with a short amount of time left on his term, and then go free with him. That would be cruel to the master, who has allowed her to work off her debt. This provision is to protect those who are trying to help, not enslave harshly and indefinitely. You are completely misinterpreting this passage. Nowhere does it imply the woman provided to the Hebrew servant is a bondservant as well. The passage clearly states the woman belongs to the master, aka she is his slave. Exodus 21 does not claim she is a Hebrew woman that is engaging in her 6 years of servitude to pay off a debt. Otherwise, she could go free after her time is up. Exactly what would be preventing her from leaving with her husband and all of her children if she were not a permanent slave of her master? After 6 years, the male Hebrew servant can go free, but the master is not going to give up his property just because the male servant has sired children with her. You said if the bondservant is willing to walk away from his wife and kids, then it's his own fault. No, it's not, because that is tantamount to blackmail. The Hebrew servant has one of two options: to give up his wife and children so he can be free, or to remain with his wife and children and continue being a slave. The passage clearly states that if the Hebrew servant says, "I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free," then his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, thus forever branding him a slave. Although there is a way out of bondage for the Hebrew servant, if he chooses love over freedom, then he and his entire family are to be slaves forever. Whatever choice the Hebrew servant makes, the Bible is very clear about what happens to the children born of his union. We see the children born to a Hebrew bondservant are not extended the same rights as their father under Mosaic law. The rights of the slave master trumps those of the children born to a member of the nation of Israel. Children born to a bondservant, who at the time is merely paying off a debt, are to suffer as slaves for the rest of their lives. Essentially, what is taking place is the Torah is providing the slave master with a loophole to breed more slaves. But to make matters worse, the father is blackmailed with the love for his children. If he is a cold-hearted bastard, then sure, he can go free. But if he does the right thing and stays with his family, then the Torah allows the slave master to profit by gaining an additional adult male slave. How can any moral society or benevolent God turn a blind eye to this level of injustice, let alone make laws to enforce it? In addition, this passage serves to demonstrate my previous point, that the only time slavery is ever mentioned with any leniency is in reference to other Israelites. However, the Torah is very clear when it comes to slaves that are captured from other nations. Foreign-born slaves never have any rights, and once placed in bondage are to remain slaves for life. If you feel I am in error, I challenge you to cite a single passage that specifically references non-Israelite slaves and the manner in which they can be legally freed from servitude. Although no such passage exists, even if it did, it would not matter, because as we've already determined throughout the course of this discussion, just because you might find a passage that gives stipulations for how one might obtain their freedom, That does not excuse the fact an immoral practice is being allowed to go on in the first place, no matter how tightly regulated it might be. All the laws regulating slavery or indentured servitude are found in the Pentateuch, meaning 5 scrolls, or 5 books of Moses. These books were given as Israel was coming out of bondage to possess the land that God had promised to Abraham and his descendants hundreds of years earlier in the book of Genesis. The judicial laws are what governed and regulated the practice of selling oneself into servitude to pay a debt. Therefore, these laws do not command Christians in modern times to do such a thing as even have bondservants. These were rules for the nation of Israel. Indeed, the laws are all addressed to Israel, not Americans of the 21st century. In fact, the Jews did not even seem to hold to all of these rules even in Jesus' time, yet Jesus did not condemn them for it. The Romans were the political power in charge at the time, and they had much harsher slavery laws and were more brutal in just about every other way imaginable. Even though the Mosaic laws given may not apply to us directly, we can draw principles out of them because God never changes, at least not the biblical God. Therefore, the laws are still useful to Christians today in their own religious practices. Even though slavery was regulated by judicial laws, that does not absolve its moral implications. Jesus absolved many Hebrew judicial laws regarding murder. Does that mean murder is no longer immoral? Although Christians of the 16th to 19th centuries were not bound to the judicial laws regulating slavery in the Old Testament, they were perfectly within their rights to create new laws, and that's just what they did. The fact Jesus never directly spoke in opposition to slavery meant, as far as the Christians of the 16th to 19th centuries were concerned, slavery was perfectly acceptable within Christianity. You said, even though the law may not apply to us directly, we can draw principles out of them because God never changes, at least not the biblical God. Yes, exactly. The laws regarding slavery were not given to us directly, but these laws clearly demonstrate that slavery is an acceptable practice so long as the proper regulations are in place. Great! So modern-day Christians can make new laws and go right on keeping slaves. Do you not see a problem with this logic? When something is immoral, it does not matter how you regulate it. If, as you claim, God never changes, then the act of slavery should have never been allowed to occur in the first place, or we should still have slavery today. The fact that slavery was widely practiced throughout the ancient world by Jews and Christians alike, but is currently an outlawed practice today, suggests a serious disconnect in the theistic understanding of morality. What we need to realize is that slavery, among many other subjects in the Bible, has always been a dilemma among men in our sin-cursed world all throughout history. The Bible was not written to reform society, but instead to reform our souls with God's salvation. The Bible attacks all of life's plagues provocatively from the inside out. Think about it. When someone accepts the true salvation of God's love, forgiveness, mercy, and grace, their soul is reformed. Someone who is truly saved by God's grace and lives like Christ will treat others with gracious love. The cure to slavery and the cure to all of the plagues in the world is curing the hearts of men, which is the Bible's purpose. If you can change a man's heart and soul, you don't need to outlaw slavery, because a man of God would never treat another man harshly against his will to profit from their inhumane labor. That is the Bible's approach to slavery, as well as all of life's evils. As we have seen, the Bible only attempts to regulate slavery and to focus the injustices on foreign-born slaves. Neither Mosaic law nor Jesus Christ make any attempt to outlaw the practice altogether. You claim the cure to slavery and the cure to all of the plagues in the world is curing the hearts of men, which is the Bible's purpose. So now you speak of slavery as if it were a plague upon humankind, when throughout this entire conversation you've been making excuses for its practice. If, as you describe, slavery really was such a plague, then why does Jesus, Peter, Paul, Matthew, Luke, Timothy, and everyone else that mentions slavery in the Bible treat this issue with such disregard? Although you claim slavery was a judicial matter that Jesus Christ served to abolish, slavery was also a matter of morality. Thus Jesus was bound to uphold the moral law. If there is indeed such a thing as a fixed standard of absolute morality, then Jesus did not live up to his role as a moral teacher. It is clear from Jesus' sermons that he was far more concerned about suppressing our natural instinct to mate, also known as lust, than he was in suppressing the immoral act of profiting from the inhumane exploitation of millions of men, women, and children across the world and throughout time. 1 Peter chapter 2 tells us that slaves unjustly suffer, and 1 Timothy chapter 6 shows us that slaves should serve their Christian masters even better, making no room for them to escape bondage. The only evidence you can provide in opposition to slavery are extremely ambiguous verses that do not mention slavery by name. However, when Jesus and the apostles do mention slavery directly, it is never in opposition or condemnation. But the final nail in the coffin is that the Bible flat out allows and even regulates slavery. If slavery is immoral, then it does not matter how well the Bible regulates it, because it still means the Bible is promoting or regulating an immoral practice. You can make whatever regulations you want to prostitution, bestiality, or illicit drug use. It still would not change the fact that according to Christian doctrine, these practices are inherently immoral. Numerous times throughout this discussion, you've made massive concessions for slavery, while failing to be consistent in your understanding that God's moral standard is absolute. If God is by nature just and right, then it would be against his very nature to inflict such horribly cruel injustices upon the world, or at the very least, he must restrain himself upon moral principle. However, all throughout the Bible we see God's unbridled fury, jealousy, and rage, inflicting incalculable harm on both his followers as well as non-believers. When I read about moral injustices in the Bible, I find it abhorrent and in total opposition to everything I hold dear. Under such philosophies as secular humanism, biblical atrocities like slavery would never be allowed to occur, let alone have laws made to regulate it. I do not feel we should have to make excuses for God. Therefore, the sheer number of immoral acts the Bible permits and regulates forces me to constantly question the Bible's integrity and authenticity. If I am to be honest with myself and follow a consistent code of moral and ethical conduct, then questions about the moral injustices contained in the pages of the Holy Bible must be accounted for. But ultimately, defending the Bible with apologetics is a fool's errand. For there is no conceivable way anyone could ever hope to justify the acts of slavery, rape, infanticide, and genocide contained in the pages of the Holy Bible. Either we accept these acts as being in accordance with the will of God, and thereby concede morality is arbitrary, or we reject these acts, and as a result, reject the Bible itself.